In the quiet corners of the American frontier, as the sun slipped behind mountains painted in dry gold and the wind stirred the dust into gentle spirals, a faint glow began to pulse from the heart of a lonely town, the saloon. It was never silent, yet it was never truly loud either. Its rhythm steady like a heartbeat that kept the frontier alive through the long, uncertain nights. The wooden doors, worn smooth from countless hands, swung open and shut as shadows came and went. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and oil lamps that hung from chains above, their light trembling over rough tables carved with initials and memories. The Wild West was no place for tenderness, yet within those dim-lit walls, a strange softness survived, tended by women known simply as saloon madams. To some, they were keepers of sin. To others, they were queens of a fragile empire built on charm and grit. In truth, they were survivors' women who had learned that in a land ruled by men and money, control was a rarer treasure than gold dust. Every evening began with quiet ritual, sweeping sawdust from the floor, checking the bottles, lighting the lamps one by one, and facing the mirror to make sure the reflection staring back still looked like someone who belonged to that world. Their power was quiet but sharp, an authority carried not through force but through understanding. The madam's gaze could settle a quarrel before fists were raised. Her voice could draw laughter out of a bitter man, and her silence could stop a liar mid-sentence. She dealt in moods more than money, reading the air like a gambler reads the cards. Outside, the streets baked under the day's heat and cooled into stillness at night. But inside the saloon, the temperature never changed, stayed at that uncertain edge between comfort and danger. Men came seeking warmth, women came seeking survival, and the madam stood between them, making sure both got just enough to come back again tomorrow. She kept the peace through small acts of grace, pouring a drink with steady hands, pretending not to see a tear wiped away, offering a smile that meant nothing and everything at once. To survive, she had to hide exhaustion beneath elegance, to turn fear into wit, to meet cruelty with patience. Sometimes, when the night grew long and the music faltered, she would stand behind the bar and watch her girls move through the haze of smoke and laughter, their faces glowing faintly under the golden lamps, their eyes distant. Each one had her own story, each one balancing hope and regret like coins in her palm. When the last customer staggered out and the lamps were turned low, the saloon would sigh into silence again. The madam would sit alone at a table, tracing the rim of her glass, listening to the wood creak softly under the weight of ghosts and memories. She would think of the days when she too had been new to this life, afraid, uncertain, full of dreams, and she would smile faintly, knowing that dreams had no place here, only endurance. Survival in the West was never about strength. It was about knowing when to speak, when to smile, and when to stay perfectly still. Outside, the dawn would begin to pale the horizon, painting the dust with silver light. Inside, the last lamp still flickered, keeping its promise against the dark. The madam would blow it out with a slow, steady breath, ready to begin again when night returned. Evening was a ceremony in the saloon, a quiet unfolding of routine that carried the same rhythm night after night, like a prayer whispered to keep the world from falling apart. As the sun began to sink behind the flat horizon, painting the sky in thin layers of orange and gray. The town outside would soften into stillness. The sound of horses faded into the distance. Boots scuffed slower across the dirt roads, and the air turned cooler, carrying with it the faint metallic scent of lamp oil and dust. Inside, the madam moved with practiced grace through the shadows, her hands steady as she trimmed wicks polished glass, and lit one lamp after another until the saloon glowed like a lantern in the wilderness. This was her domain, fragile but constant, built from nothing but habit and will. Each lamp she lit felt like an act of defiance, a small rebellion against the darkness that swallowed everything beyond those wooden walls. The girls would arrive soon, one by one, with tired smiles and painted faces, whispering greetings as they adjusted their skirts and checked their hair in the mirror behind the bar. The madam would nod to each of them, her expression calm but watchful, reading their moods like weather signs. She could tell when one had quarreled with a lover, when another was ill, or when fear hid behind too bright laughter. Managing a saloon was never just about running a business. It was about managing people's storms, keeping tempers low, hope alive, and despair quiet. The piano man would arrive next, usually half drunk, his coat smelling faintly of tobacco and rain, and he'd begin to play something slow and meandering, a tune that seemed to float in the smoky air without ever finding a home. By then, the first customers would trickle in, ranch hands with pay burning in their pockets, gamblers with hungry eyes, lonely men who needed to forget the silence of their rooms. The madam greeted them all with the same soft smile, offering warmth that cost nothing but meant everything. She knew who could be trusted and who could not, who was likely to start a fight and who was too broken to try. Her job was balanced much leniency, invited chaos, too much strictness scared away the few who could still pay. The night would stretch long and unhurried, filled with small exchanges of laughter and coins, glances and sighs. Sometimes, when the noise rose and the lamps flickered, the madam would pause to look around her room and feel the odd peace that came from repetition. Nothing truly changed, yet everything required attention. The tables needed wiping, the bottles refilling, the girls comforting, the customers calming. Each motion, each word carried the same weight. Keep the night moving, keep the peace, keep surviving. Outside, the world was harsh and uncertain storms, debt and danger, but inside, under the dim lamps and tired piano songs, time slowed to something almost gentle. Near midnight, the laughter softened, the music slowed, and the air grew heavy with fatigue. The madam would collect the night's earnings, count them carefully, and lock them away. She never looked at the money with greed, only with relief meant another day, another chance to hold this fragile order together. As she watched the lamps burn low, their light trembling like tired eyes, she would breathe in the scent of oil and wood, feeling the strange comfort of knowing that nothing lasted, yet everything repeated. The ritual would begin again tomorrow, as it always did, as it always must. To live as a madam in the Wild West was to speak a language that had no words, a quiet code of gestures, glances, and pauses that decided whether a night ended in peace or in blood. It was not a life built on power, but on awareness and instinct, sharpened by necessity. The saloon, for all its noise and color, existed on the edge of collapse. One wrong word could turn laughter into violence. One careless look could spark a fight that ruined the night's earnings. The madam learned early that survival meant listening more than speaking. She could sense tension before it rose, see anger forming behind a smile, and feel when the air turned heavy with danger. Her survival was a matter of rhythm, the slow and constant pulse of her intuition guiding her through every uncertain evening. Men came to the saloon for comfort they couldn't name, and she gave them something that looked like kindness, but was really control, disguised as care. Her words were chosen carefully, soft enough to calm, firm enough to command. Every compliment, every glance, every laugh had purpose. She was part performer, part peacekeeper, part mother, and part ghost there but not truly seen. The girls who worked for her learned this language too. They learned to smile without promise, to dance without attachment, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, and listen to stories that went nowhere. The madam taught them to survive, not through rules, but through quiet examples. How to keep dignity when disrespected, how to walk away without appearing weak, how to turn insult into charm. It wasn't heroism, it was endurance. The West was unkind to women, but the saloon gave them a strange kind of control over the chaos. The men thought they ruled the night, but it was the madam who decided when the cards were shuffled, when the music stopped, when the last glass was poured. She moved through the room like a conductor guiding a fragile orchestra, keeping the noise from collapsing into chaos. There were times when fights broke out despite her best efforts, when chairs scraped and tempers flared, and then she would appear between the men, calm as dusk. Her presence enough to shame them back into quiet. No one dared strike her. Even the most reckless drunk understood that the madam was sacred ground, the thin line between order and ruin. When peace returned, she would nod once, refill a glass, and let the night continue as if nothing had happened. Later, when the room emptied and the air cooled, she would stand by the window and look out at the sleeping town. Beyond the lamplight stretched the endless plains, silent, wide, and indifferent. She often wondered if there was another life waiting somewhere beyond those hills. But the thought faded quickly, replaced by the dull comfort of routine. The saloon was her world, the only world that made sense. Every night she played her part, and every morning she survived it. That, she knew, was enough. In the stillness, after the last lamp was turned down, when only the faint smell of smoke and whiskey lingered, she would whisper to herself not prayers, not regrets, just small reminders. Tomorrow will come, and I will be ready. The night had its language, and she had learned to speak it fluently. The nights in the saloon were not measured by hours, but by songs, by the soft rise and fall of piano notes that floated through the smoky air like memories refusing to fade. The music wasn't always good. Sometimes the piano keys stuck, and sometimes the tune wavered, but that didn't matter. It was enough to fill the silence between the clinking of glasses and the murmurs of conversation. Beneath that lazy melody, the saloon lived and breathed, its rhythm steady and unhurried. The madam moved through it all with a kind of quiet grace, her steps measured, her voice low, her eyes always watching. She knew that the true life of the saloon happened not in its laughter, but in its whispers, small exchanges that drifted just under the music. A gambler might lean close to a companion, muttering about debts or deals. A prospector might speak of a hidden claim in the hills. A heartbroken man might confess a story no one would ever remember. The madam heard everything without seeming to listen. It was her gift to know without asking, to sense without speaking. The whispers told her the shape of her world, the shifting tides of loyalty and danger. She filed every secret away in the quiet corners of her mind, using them when the time came, never earlier. Information, she had learned, was worth more than gold dust in the West. It could protect her, save her girls, or, sometimes, destroy an enemy before he knew he was won. Yet she never used it carelessly. The madam had no love for revenge. She only cared for balance. Too much noise brought trouble. Too much silence bred suspicion. Her power lived in moderation, in the art of staying just visible enough to matter. Sometimes, when the music grew softer and the crowd mellowed into that sleepy calm that came just before dawn, she would rest her hands on the bar and close her eyes, feeling the hum of the room around her. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something closer, fragile, calm, born from repetition and weariness. The piano man, half lost in his own world, would keep playing a slow waltz, and the women would move lazily through the haze of smoke and light, collecting the last coins, whispering their goodnights. A few men would stay behind, too tired or too sad to leave, and the madam would let them linger. She understood that sometimes silence was the only comfort people could afford. When the final chord faded, the lamps dimmed, and the air settled into stillness, she would gather the whispers left behind the fragments of stories, the half-spoken confessions, and hold them in her mind like pebbles smoothed by time. They were reminders of how fragile it all was, how easily one night could end everything. Still, she did not fear it. The West was built on impermanence. Everything was borrowed, from the land to the light itself. The madam, too, borrowed her power from the night, and when dawn came, she returned it without regret. She would wipe down the bar, sweep the floor, and breathe in the faint scent of whiskey and oil, knowing that the music would rise again tomorrow, and that the whispers would return to fill the empty spaces beneath it. When the first pale light of morning crept across the horizon, it came not with songbirds or laughter, but with silence, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world itself is tired. Inside the saloon, the air was still thick with the scent of smoke and whiskey, the floor faintly sticky beneath the weight of the night's stories. The piano sat quiet now, its keys glinting faintly in the dim dawn light, a few notes of last night's melody still clinging to the edges of memory. The madam sat alone at one of the corner tables, her posture straight but her eyes soft, tracing slow circles on the rim of her glass. She had not slept, not really. Sleep was a luxury for those who had nothing to lose. For her, the mornings were for counting, not just coins or bottles, but people, moments, and chances. She made sure every girl had made it home safe, every debt recorded, every bottle tallied. It was a ritual, as quiet as it was necessary. The girls, some still half asleep, would move through the dim room with slow, practiced gestures, tidying chairs, sweeping dust, and whispering to each other in tired voices that faded into the sound of the broom. They would laugh softly about the night's oddities, a drunken promise here, a lost bet therein. Though their laughter was faint, it made the room feel alive again. The madam listened without joining in. Her smile was small, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but still means something. She had lived long enough to know that every morning was a borrowed victory. Outside, the town would begin to stir, the blacksmith hammering faintly in the distance, a wagon creaking down the street, the low call of a rooster echoing between wooden walls. The saloon, for all its noise at night, belonged to the mornings now. In this hour, it was hers alone, stripped of its masks and music. The light revealed everything: the scuffs on the floor, the scratches on the tables, the tired lines around her eyes. But it also revealed something gentler: endurance. The saloon had survived another night, and so had she. The madam rose slowly, collecting ledgers and counting money with calm precision. Her hands moved easily, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere, to the women who had come and gone, to the ones who left chasing dreams that didn't exist, and to those who stayed because the saloon was the only place that would have them. She sometimes wondered if anyone would remember them. These women who lived between the hours, their lives folded into the margins of history. Probably not. History rarely remembered those who kept the world quietly turning. Yet she found peace in that. There was dignity in being unseen, in building something fragile that survived night after night. As the sun rose higher, its light spilled across the tables, turning the dust into gold. The madam smiled faintly and whispered to herself, "We made it again." She walked to the bar, poured the last of the whiskey into a small glass, and raised it in a silent toast to the lamps that still glowed faintly, to the ghosts that lingered kindly, to the women still sleeping in the back rooms, and to the endless, unremarkable tomorrow. The world outside was waking, but for now, within those wooden walls, everything was still. The saloon, for all its roughness and ruin, was home. And though morning always came too soon, it always came gently, as if the light itself knew better than to disturb the dreams of those who had survived another night. Power in the Wild West was never loud. It did not shout from the streets or wear a badge. It whispered in small decisions, in who was served first, in who was allowed to stay, and who was quietly asked to leave. For the saloon madam, power was a delicate art, something she carried like a fragile glass, never spilling it, never showing it off. It was a power earned through patience and presence, through the kind of authority that didn't need to be spoken. Every man who walked through those swinging doors knew that the room bent to her rhythm, even if they pretended not to notice. She never demanded respect. She simply received it, the way the dawn receives the light. But maintaining that balance required constant care. Each night brought new tempers, new debts, new dangers. The madam watched it all like a quiet guardian, managing her small world with calm precision. She knew the faces of the drifters who meant trouble, the gamblers who cheated too icily, the ranchers who drank too fast. Her eyes missed nothing. When a voice rose too sharp or a hand lingered too long, she intervened before trouble could grow teeth. Sometimes it was just a look, soft, unyielding, enough to cool a temper. Other times it was a word, firm but polite, the kind that reminded men that this was her space, her law. And though she never carried a gun, every man in town knew that crossing her was a mistake one did not repeat. The sheriff himself stopped by, often not to enforce the law, but to make sure hers stayed intact. There was an understanding between them, a quiet respect built on necessity. The saloon kept the town from coming apart. It gave restless men a place to leave their tempers instead of spilling them into the streets. And at the center of it all, the madam kept her order like a clockmaker, tending to gears polishing, winding, adjusting, always moving but never rushing. The women under her care depended on that rhythm. Some were young and hopeful, others older and tired, but all of them knew the safety of her steady rules. They followed her lead, not out of fear, but because she made chaos bearable. To the outside world, a saloon was just noise and vice, but inside, it was something else, a fragile sanctuary built on unspoken trust. The madam's touch was in everything: the soft glow of the lamps, the neatly arranged chairs, the music that always started and stopped on time. She even managed the way laughter rose and fell, the way the night seemed to hum with gentle balance. And though she often looked calm, she carried the strain quietly. Every night, as she moved through the room, she wore her composure like armor. She could not afford to falter. If she did, the whole illusion would crumble. Only when the last customer left and the lamps burned low did she allow herself to breathe, her shoulders softening as silence reclaimed the air. Power, she understood, was not about strength or wealth. It was about survival, the ability to stand gracefully in a place that never stopped shifting beneath your feet. That was her secret art, the quiet gift that made her more than a businesswoman, more than a hostess. She was the keeper of calm in a world built on storms, and every night she held it together with nothing but presence and poise. There was a quiet burden to beauty in the West, one that the madam understood better than anyone. Every smile, every ribbon, every flicker of charm that lit the saloon came with a cost measured not in money, but in exhaustion. The women who worked for her knew that the face they wore at night was a kind of armor, a disguise painted over fatigue, worry, and the faint ache of dreams that no longer fit this world. The madam herself was their reflection, the one who showed them how to turn wariness into grace. Before the doors opened each evening, she would stand before the mirror in her small room upstairs, the air heavy with the scent of powder and oil, and slowly prepare herself. The act of getting ready was not vanity, was survival. The careful painting of lips, the arranging of hair, the smoothing of fabric, all of it was ritual, a way to summon control from chaos. Downstairs, the girls did the same, laughing quietly, sharing combs and secrets, the sound of their chatter floating through the wooden walls like birdsong before dusk. The madam listened, smiling faintly, though she rarely joined in. She had learned long ago that laughter could be fragile, that it was better to protect it from too much truth. As the lamps flickered to life and the piano struck its first hesitant notes, the transformation was complete. The tired women became glowing figures beneath the amber light, moving through the haze of music and smoke with the illusion of ease. Their voices softened, their gestures smoothed, and the night began. The men saw beauty and charm, never guessing at the layers of practice and pain beneath it. The madam admired her girls for their endurance, though she rarely said so. She knew how much it took to keep smiling when hearts were heavy, how much courage it required to turn fear into laughter. Sometimes, when she caught their reflections in the mirror behind the bar, she saw not just women, but survivors, each one carrying her own invisible story. And yet, no one outside those walls would ever know them. To the world, they were only faces in the light, names that changed as easily as the songs on the piano. The madam often wondered if they minded being forgotten, or if perhaps forgetting was its own kind of mercy. When the night grew late and the lamps burned low, she would see the beauty fade, the smiles tiring, the eyes dimming. Then she would signal gently a subtle nod, a quiet word, and the girls would know it was time to rest. As the customers drifted away, the saloon would settle into soft silence once more. The madam would help them unpin their hair, wipe away the paint, and pour tea instead of whiskey. These small gestures were her way of caring, though she never called it that. They were too proud for pity, and she was too proud to offer it. Instead, she gave them calm, and calm was enough. In the mirror's reflection, she would see their true faces, lined with fatigue, yes, but also with strength. It was a reminder that beauty, in its quietest form, was not what they showed to the world, but what they held within. By dawn, when the lamps were out and the room smelled of dust and dreams, she would sit alone and whisper a small promise to herself to keep the faces bright, no matter how heavy the night became. The saloon was a crossroads, a place where faces came and went like passing weather. The madam learned not to remember too much, not names, not promises, not the soft words that men said when the night grew long and the whiskey ran low. Travelers drifted through like ghosts from the plains, miners with hands scarred from stone, soldiers on leave, gamblers whose luck had turned, preachers who had lost their faith but not their habit of speaking softly. Each one arrived with stories, and each one left them behind like footprints in the dust. The madam listened when she had to, nodding gently, never interrupting. Some told her of wives back east, of children they barely knew, of homes that might not exist anymore. Others spoke only in sighs, their eyes fixed on the amber glow of the lamp, searching for something that could not be found. She did not comfort them with lies. She offered silence, which was kinder. Silence had weight, and in her saloon, it was the one thing freely given. Sometimes a man would linger for weeks, thinking he had found something, perhaps affection, perhaps redemption, but the madam always knew better. The West had no room for permanence. When morning came, the wagons moved on, and so did they. She never asked them to stay. She had long ago learned that goodbyes were easier when you never hoped for hellos to last. Yet, every departure left a trace, a forgotten glove, a hat, a debt, a scent of tobacco that hung in the curtains for days. The saloon carried those fragments quietly, like a book collecting the pages of a story no one finished writing. Her girls sometimes grew attached to young to understand the rhythm of leaving, and the madam would have to remind them gently, "We are here to keep the night company, not to hold it." It wasn't cruelty, only truth, and in the West, truth was a rare kindness. When loneliness pressed too close, she would climb the stairs to her small balcony and watch the street below. The town slept like a tired beast, the dust shimmering faintly under the moonlight. Somewhere, a train whistle might echo far off, soft and distant, a sound that always made her chest ache in a way she didn't care to name. She wondered where all those travelers went, if they remembered the saloon, the laughter, the light. Probably not. The West devoured memory as easily as it devoured men. Still, she liked to imagine that somewhere, in a quiet moment, one of them might recall her voice or the warmth of the room she kept. Perhaps that was enough. She never wished for gratitude. She only wished for gentleness, for all of them. wherever the road carried them next. By dawn, the town would wake, and the traces of strangers would vanish beneath new dust. The madam would open the doors again that evening, sweep the same floor, polish the same bottles, and smile for new faces. It was a pattern without beginning or end, and though it might seem lonely, it had its peace. In repetition, there was safety. In letting go, there was strength. That was her secret, the art of holding the world for a moment and releasing it before it could hurt her. The saloon would always have visitors who never stayed, but that, she thought, was part of its beauty. Like the light of a lamp, it existed only for as long as it was needed. Every night in the saloon left traces, small and ordinary, that only the madam seemed to notice. A coin slipped beneath the counter, a broken button on the floor, a smudge of rouge on a glass. She collected these details without trying, the way dust collects in sunlight. They became her private record-book, real ledger that no ink could hold. The book she kept behind the bar told one story, neat and practical, all numbers and names. But the one she kept in her mind was made of fragments, who laughed the loudest but meant it least, who came back after saying goodbye, who left without a word. These were the currencies of her world, invisible and invaluable. Every night had its cost, and every person carried their own price. The girls paid in weariness, the piano man in loneliness, the customers in pieces of themselves they didn't notice missing. The madam paid in stillness, by holding it all together and letting none of it show. Sometimes, when the lamps burned low and the piano had gone silent, she would take out the real ledger, the one of paperhand, sit by the soft glow of a single flame. Her handwriting was steady, precise, a habit formed from years of quiet responsibility. She would tally the bottles sold, the debts owed, the wages due. But as her pen moved, her mind wandered elsewhere, through the hidden book of memory. She remembered the girl who once sang instead of serving drinks, her voice too tender for a place like this. She thought of the old prospector who left his gold nugget as payment and never returned. She even thought of herself, long ago, when she had first arrived, unsure and afraid, holding a borrowed name. Time had softened the edges of those memories, but not their weight. She understood now that the saloon was a place where stories went to rest, not to be told. It was not history that she kept, it was aftermath. All the people who came through her doors carried endings, the end of a love, a dream, a fortune. She gave them a place to set it down gently. That was her unspoken service, one no one could list on a ledger. The town around her changed little. Seasons passed, but the saloon remained the same walls, same lamps, same smell of smoke and whiskey. Some nights, when she walked the floor alone, she could almost feel the past lingering beside her. The ghosts were not cruel. They were simply tired, like everything else in the West. She imagined them sitting quietly at the bar, watching her work, remembering how it used to be. There was comfort in that thought, strange as it was. It made her feel less alone. The madam knew her legacy would not be written down, but she didn't mind. Her life existed in small, unnoticed gestures, in the peace she kept, in the order she maintained, in the kindness she offered without name. When she closed her ledger each night, she would pause for a moment, listening to the silence as if waiting for the room to breathe back. Then she would whisper softly, all accounted for, even though she knew that not everything ever truly could be. The lamplight would flicker, and the saloon would sink once more into its familiar calm, its quiet depths safely hidden in her care. There always came a moment just before dawn when even the lamps seemed to grow tired. Their glow dimmed to a gentle sigh, and the saloon fell into that half-light between night and morning, when the world itself felt paused. The madam loved that hour most of all. It was the only time the building belonged entirely to Hertha. Laughter had faded. The chairs stood in quiet rows, and the air smelled faintly of ash and perfume. She would walk slowly through the room, her hand brushing the tops of tables as if greeting old friends. Every surface carried a story, every dent and scratch a memory. Here, a glass had been broken in a quarrel long ago. There, someone had carved a name with a pocket knife, too deep to ever sand away. The madam traced these marks with gentle fingers, knowing that in their own small way they were her history. Not grand, not loud, but steady and real. She moved behind the bar, poured herself a small drink, not for pleasure, but for ritual, and sat in the stillness. The first pale line of dawn slipped through the window, cutting across the floorboards like a quiet secret. Outside, the town began to stir, the sound of horses shifting, a wagon rolling somewhere far off. Inside, everything stayed suspended in calm. For a few minutes, she allowed herself to feel the weariness she always hid. Her back ached, her eyes burned, her thoughts drifted toward nowhere in particular. Yet beneath it all was a deep, quiet satisfaction. She had made it through another night without trouble. Her girls were safe. The saloon still stood. That was enough. She often thought about what life might have been if she had chosen differently, if she had married, if she had stayed back east, if she had taken the train instead of stepping off it all those years ago. But such thoughts never lasted long. The West didn't reward what it only cared for what was. And what was for her was this: a life built from fragments, lit by lamps, held together by patience and grace. As the light grew stronger, she snuffed out the flames one by one, her movements slow and practiced. Each lamp made a soft sound, a whisper of smoke rising like a closing sigh. When the last one went dark, the room looked softer, like a memory fading from view. She stood there for a long moment, hands resting on the counter, eyes distant but calm. This was the quiet she lived for. Not the world outside might never know her name, might never write about her in history books, but the small peace she built each night was its own kind of victory. She thought of her girls asleep upstairs, the faint rhythm of their breaths drifting through the floorboards, and felt a warmth that no whiskey could match. They were her reason, her family, her legacy. When the sun finally rose above the rooftops, she turned away from the window, smoothing her skirt with one last careful motion. "All right," she whispered to herself, voice low and steady. "We start again tonight." Then she climbed the stairs, her footsteps soft, the saloon behind her wrapped in the tender hush of morning. Outside, another day was beginning, but for her, this was the end of everything, and the beginning of everything else. The lamps slept, and so did she, in the gentle peace she had earned. There were things the madam never spoke about, not because she didn't remember them, but because words could never hold them right. Silence was her truest language, and over the years, she had learned to wield it like a shield. In a world where men filled the air with noise, boasts, bargains, Laughter, too loud to mean anything. Her quiet carried its own power. She had seen what speaking could cost. A wrong word could draw anger, suspicion, or pity, and she wanted none of those. So she kept her voice soft, her replies measured, her thoughts folded carefully beneath the surface of her calm. The girls sometimes asked about her past, curious about where she came from, what her real name was, or how she'd come to own the saloon. She would only smile, shaking her head. "It's not a story worth telling," she'd say, though that wasn't true. The truth was simply too fragile. It lived in half-remembered towns, in faces long gone, in moments she preferred to let rest. Every madam carried such ghost stories that might have begun with love, with loss, or simply with hunger. In the West, women reinvented themselves, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. To survive meant leaving behind the parts of life that could slow you down. And so she had, trading her old name for a new one, her fears for poise, her sorrow for silence. That silence became her craft. It shaped her reputation, drew people to her, and kept danger at a distance. Men trusted her because she never repeated what she heard. Her saloon became a place where secrets could breathe safely. Cards were played, deals were struck, hearts were broken, and not a word ever left the room. She didn't write anything down that mattered, didn't ask questions that led to answers. In a town full of stories, she was the one place where they disappeared. That was her power and her burden. Sometimes, when the piano played slow and the night stretched long, she felt the weight of all those untold things pressing quietly around her. It was like sitting in a room full of invisible people, each whispering fragments of lives that could never be spoken aloud. But she didn't fear it. She understood that silence was not emptiness. It was space. Space for healing, for forgetting, for starting again. She had built her world from that space, and within it, others found comfort too. The girls learned to follow her example, to listen more than they spoke, to move like calm water around men's tempers and moods. Together, they turned silence into safety, and safety into strength. It was their shared secret, this unspoken understanding, that peace could be built from quiet. Outside, the world was full of noise, gunshots, gossip, the endless groan of wagon wheels. But inside her saloon, the silence had a hum of its own, gentle and golden, like the light from the lamps. When she walked through the room at night, her footsteps made no sound on the wooden floor. Even the piano seemed to soften its tone when she passed by. The men never noticed, but the women did. They saw how stillness followed her like a shadow, how her silence carried more meaning than any sermon or law. And in that stillness, they found something rare dignity. The madam never called it that, of course. She only said, "We don't need to speak to be understood." And in that one quiet truth, her whole life seemed to rest, steady and unbroken, like a lamp's flame protected from the wind. There were nights when the madam swore she could hear the walls whisper, not in voices exactly, but in faint echoes of sound, the scrape of boots long gone, the soft laughter of a woman who no longer lived there, the sigh of a door closing itself. The saloon was old, its wood soaked in years of breath and music, and sometimes it seemed alive with memory. The madam never feared it. She believed that places, like people, held on to what they witnessed, and that her saloon had simply learned to remember kindly. When the world outside grew to wild, when gunfire cracked in the distance, or drunken shouts tore through the street, she would step into the empty hall and let the hush of the building calm her. The walls had a way of listening that no person ever could. They carried the sound of every song that had ever been played, every soft word that had ever passed between strangers, every dream that had been born and broken within their reach. To her, it felt like standing inside a living diary, one that didn't judge or speak, only watched. The girls sometimes teased her about it. "You treat this place like it's your child," they'd say with fond smiles. She only nodded because, in some quiet way, it was true. The saloon had grown under her care. It had moods like any living thing. Some nights it hummed with laughter and light, and others it ached with stillness. She knew its sounds the way a mother knows her child's breathing. A creak in the stairs meant someone was coming down too early. A rattle at the window meant the wind had shifted. Every noise told a story, and she listened the way some people prayed. Sometimes, late at night, when everyone had gone and the lamps were low, she would rest her hand against the bar's smooth surface, tracing the grain of the wood. It felt warm, as if holding the heat of every touch it had ever known. That thought comforted her, the idea that nothing was ever truly gone, only absorbed, transformed, made part of something larger. The saloon carried its people that way. It remembered them even when the world forgot. Once, a traveling painter stopped by for a single night. He drank quietly, sketched in the corner, and left at dawn. Months later, a stranger brought her one of his paintings, The Saloon at Dusk, golden light spilling from its windows like honey. She hung it above the piano, and sometimes she caught herself staring at it, wondering if the walls in that picture whispered to. The girls found peace there as well. After long nights, they would sit on the stairs or lean against the doorframe, listening to the building's gentle settling. "It's talking again," one might say, half smiling. "It's just tired," another would reply. And somehow, that made sense. The saloon, after all, carried all their weariness, their laughter, their lives. It was more than wood and nails, it was memory wrapped in lamplight. The madam often thought that when she was gone, the place would go on whispering without her, passing her story along the way it had passed so many others. That idea didn't make her sad, it felt right. After all, she had never wanted fame or monument. All she wanted was to be remembered gently, like a song that lingers after it ends. And she knew the walls would do that for her, as they had for everyone who'd ever called this place home. He came one quiet evening, just as the last light of sunset faded from the windows. A tall man in a long coat, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a hat that had seen too many miles. The madam noticed him the moment he stepped through the doors, not because he was loud or threatening, but because he wasn't. He moved carefully, like a man who had learned to carry his past in silence. When he sat at the bar, he didn't order whiskey like most. He asked for coffee, black, and spoke with a voice low enough to blend with the hum of the lamps. The madam poured his cup herself. Something about him felt familiar, though she couldn't place it. He thanked her softly, and when he lifted his hand to take the cup, she saw it a silver watch, old but well kept, its surface engraved with tiny patterns that shimmered under the light. She knew watches like that. Once, long ago, someone had given her one, though she had pawned it to survive her first winter out west. For a moment, Her thoughts drifted back to that other life, that other name she'd left behind. The man caught her glance, but said nothing. They shared the kind of silence that needed no explanation. He stayed until late, sipping slowly, listening to the piano. Once in a while, he'd pull out the watch and turn it in his hand, as if measuring time not by seconds, but by memories. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to flirt or to boast. He asked her, simply, "How long have you been here?" The madam hesitated. She had been asked many questions in her life, but never that one in such a gentle tone. "Long enough," she said, her voice quiet but steady. He nodded, as though that answer meant something to him. Then he smiled a small, tired smile that carried years inside it. The two of them sat there a while longer, not speaking, just breathing in the soft rhythm of the saloon. Around them, the night stretched and sighed. When he rose to leave, he placed a single silver coin on the counter. "For the peace," he said. She watched him go, the door swinging shut behind him with a sigh of wind. For a long time, she stood there, staring at the coin. Then she looked at the clock on the wall, the hands ticking steadily. Something about that rhythm, the same as the watch, the same as her own heartbeat, felt like an old memory brushing against the present. The girls noticed her silence when she came upstairs later, but they didn't ask. They had learned, as she had, that some moments were better left unspoken. That night, when the saloon was empty and the lamps burned low, the madam stood by the bar again, her hand resting near the silver coin. She thought about all the strangers who had passed through her doors, how each one left behind a small trace, even if only a breath of air or a forgotten sound. She wondered who the man with the silver watch really was. Maybe a ghost from another life. Maybe just another traveler passing through. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, for a few quiet minutes, she had felt seen not as a madam or a keeper of secrets, but simply as a woman, alive and listening to the slow ticking of time in a world that never stood still. There was an old piano in the corner of the saloon, its wood darkened by time and touch. No one remembered who had brought it there or how it had survived the endless years of dust and smoke, but it had become the heartbeat of the place. Every night, its notes drifted through the air like the voice of a ghost that had forgotten how to leave. The madam often thought the piano understood her better than most people did. It spoke in whispers and pauses, in soft melodies that never tried too hard to be heard. The man who played it, an aging musician named Ellis, had been with her longer than any of the girls. His hair was white at the edges now, and his fingers, though slower, still carried tenderness. He didn't play for applause. He played for calm, for the way music softened the sharp corners of the night. Sometimes, when the saloon grew too loud, the madam would give him a small nod, and the sound of the piano would shift quiet, low, a kind of hush disguised as melody. It worked every time. The men's voices dropped, the laughter gentled, the air settled like dust after a storm. She often wondered if the piano held the power, or if it was Ellis himself. He never spoke much, but his playing told stories no words could hold. Some nights he played songs from back east, soft waltzes that made the girls close their eyes and imagine another life. Other nights he let the keys wander, creating music that seemed to belong only to the saloon. The madam always listened, even when she was working. The notes wove through her thoughts like smoke, filling the empty spaces she didn't let herself feel. After closing time, when everyone had gone, Ellis would sometimes play one last tune for her alone. She'd sit near the bar with a cup of tea, her hands folded, her expression unreadable. Neither of them ever spoke during those moments. They didn't need to. The piano did all the speaking for them, soft, steady, carrying pieces of memory in every note. One night, when the air outside was thick with summer heat, Ellis finished his song and said, without looking up, "You ever think this place listens to us?" The madam smiled faintly. "All the time," she replied. "That's why we have to be careful what we say." He chuckled, low and tired. "Then it's heard more sorrow than song." She didn't answer, but she thought about that for a long time after. Maybe sorrow was a kind of song, one that only certain hearts could hear. When Ellis passed away a few winters later, quietly in his sleep, the piano went silent for a while. The girls couldn't bear to touch it. The madam left a lamp burning beside it every night, as if waiting for him to return. Eventually, she hired another player, a younger man with quick fingers and a bright smile. He played beautifully, but the piano never sounded the same. It had learned Ellis's rhythm, the pauses, the weight, the restraint, and no one else could give it that voice again. The madam didn't mind. She didn't want perfection. She wanted memory. The piano still spoke, just in a different tongue. And every night, when the last note faded into silence, she would close her eyes and listen, certain that somewhere inside those strings, Ellis was still playing softly, slowly, for her. After Ellis passed, the saloon never quite sounded the same. The new pianist played well, beautifully, even, but the space between the notes felt different, as if the air had forgotten how to rest. The madam noticed it more than anyone else. She had always listened for the silences, not the songs. Music filled the room, yes, but it was the quiet that gave it meaning. The pause that reminded everyone what it meant to stop and breathe. In the months that followed, she came to cherish those pauses more than ever. The saloon still thrived, the lamps still burned, the laughter still rose and fell like tidewater. But she found herself drawn to the moments after, when the piano stopped. The voices faded, and the night seemed to hold its breath. Those were the moments that belonged only to her. She would stand behind the bar, her hand resting on the smooth counter, and listen to the silence as if it were a song no one else could hear. It was in that silence that she felt closest to the truth of things, that everything in life, joy, pain, memory, survival, was just movement between sounds. The music ended, but the living continued, soft and unsteady, like a heart still beating after grief. One night, after closing, she sat beside the piano for the first time in years. The lamp beside her flickered gently, the shadows swaying across the floor. Her fingers hovered above the keys, uncertain. She hadn't played since before she'd owned the saloon, since before the West had hardened her hands and softened her voice. Slowly, she pressed one key, then another. The sound was uneven, fragile but true. The piano seemed to recognize her touch, answering in kind, as though it had been waiting. She smiled, small and real, the kind of smile she rarely let anyone see. For a long time, she played nothing in particular, just letting the notes wander where they wished. It wasn't music, not really, it was remembering. The room filled with it, the way dawn fills a valley, slow and tender. When she stopped, the silence that followed was deeper than before, almost sacred. She looked around at the empty chairs, the sleeping lamps, the shadows clinging softly to the walls. Everything seemed to breathe with her. She whispered, "Thank you," though she didn't know whether she meant it for Ellis, for the piano, or for the life that had brought her here. Maybe for all of it. That night, she didn't go upstairs. She stayed there, beside the piano, listening to the faint ticking of the clock and the slow settling of the wood. The world outside was still dark, but she didn't feel lonely. The silence felt kind again. It wasn't the hollow sort that hurt, it was the kind that wrapped around her like an old shawl, worn and warm. As the first light of morning crept through the curtains, she rested her head on her arm and closed her eyes. For once, she didn't think about survival, or money, or the endless rhythm of nights and days. She simply let herself exist in the quiet, after the music, the place where everything finally made sense. The saloon, the life, the silence, they had all been part of the same song. And at last, she had learned to hear its ending, not as sorrow, but as peace. The storm rolled in without warning, no slow build, no whisper of wind to announce itself. One moment the night was still and breathless, the next it was alive with thunder. The saloon shuddered as lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like memory made visible. The madam stood at the bar, her hand on the lamp's glass, steadying it as the walls trembled. Storms were rare, this deep in the desert, and when they came like old ghost sangre, beautiful and impossible to ignore. Outside, the wind tore through the street, kicking up loose boards and dry tumbleweeds. The girls huddled together near the staircase, their faces pale in the flickering light. "It'll pass," the madam said softly, though she wasn't sure. Her voice carried the kind of calm that only comes from long years of surviving worse things than weather. She moved from lamp to lamp, lowering the flames so they wouldn't blow out. Each small gesture was practiced, almost ritual. The saloon had seen nights like this before, nights when the world outside raged, and all that stood between chaos and comfort were four walls, a few flames, and her steady hands. As thunder rolled again, she caught sight of her reflection in the mirror behind the bar. The glass quivered with each gust, distorting her face into something older, quieter. She almost didn't recognize herself. Maybe that was what storms did. They reminded you how fragile all this was. A single spark, a broken shutter, and everything you'd built could vanish in smoke and rain. Still, she didn't flinch. She had built this place out of dust and luck, and she wasn't about to let the wind undo it. When the lightning flashed again, she saw something strange in the street, a figure moving slowly through the storm, wrapped in a coat, head bowed against the rain. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it. But then came a knock on the door, soft but steady. The girls froze. Who could be out there now? One whispered. The madam hesitated only a second before answering. Someone with nowhere else to go. She opened the door, and the storm rushed in like a living thing, cold and loud. The man who stepped through was drenched, his hat dripping, his boots leaving dark marks on the floor. He looked around with tired eyes, the kind that had seen too much horizon. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion. The madam nodded and led him to a chair near the stove. "You're safe here," she said simply. That had become her promise, to strangers and to herself. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines carved deep by years of travel. He said little, but the quiet between them was enough. Outside, the thunder softened, the rain easing into a slow rhythm like breathing. The girls relaxed, their whispers fading into the steady patter on the roof. The madam poured the traveler a drink coffee this time, not whiskey, and sat across from him. For a long while, they just listened to the storm. It felt like the world was washing itself clean. "It's been a long road," the man said finally. "They all are," she replied. When he smiled, it was faint but real. And in that small exchange, something in the room shifted, not loud or visible, but present. The storm raged outside, but inside the saloon, there was only warmth, the soft hum of survival, and the quiet comfort of two souls who knew how to endure. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean and strangely new. The air smelled of wet dust and cedar, and the sun crept through the clouds like someone returning after a long absence. The traveler still sat where she had left him, near the stove, his hat resting on his knee. He looked less like a stranger now, and more like part of the room, another quiet shape among many. The madam brought him breakfast, simple bread and coffee, and when she set it down, he smiled with a politeness that felt practiced. "You've been kind," he said. "Most folks stop trusting strangers after dark." She shrugged. "Out here, everyone's a stranger. Might as well be kind until there's a reason not to." He seemed to like that answer. For a long time, they ate in silence, the only sound, the creak of the saloon settling as it dried from the storm. Finally, he spoke again, his voice slow, as if measuring each word. "I used to be a lawman, years back, before I learned the law doesn't always mean justice." The madam didn't ask for details. She had met many men who carried stories heavy as their saddlebags. They rarely needed questions. They only needed a listener. "I thought if I followed the rules, the world might make sense," he continued. "But the world doesn't work like that. It doesn't care who's right, only who's left standing." He laughed quietly, a sound without much joy. The madam poured more coffee and let him talk. His words came slower now, like a river finding its way through stones. He spoke of a town far to the east, of a name he no longer used, of a woman who'd once waited for him but stopped when the waiting turned into years. "When she left, I thought I'd lost everything," he said. "Now I think maybe I was never meant to stay still long enough to be found." The madam understood that kind of loneliness, the kind that wasn't about being alone, but about not belonging anywhere anymore. She didn't say so, but he must have seen it in her eyes, because he nodded slightly, as if they shared a secret. "You run this place by yourself?" he asked after a while. "Mostly. The girls help, but they come and go, and you stay. Someone has to." He smiled at that, a small, respectful smile. Not pitying, not curious, just real. "You remind me of the desert," he said. "You look still, but there's a lot moving underneath." She didn't answer, but the words lingered with her long after he left the table. As the day stretched on, the saloon came back to life, the girls sweeping. The lamps polished laughter returning in slow trickles. The traveler stayed, helping with small repairs without being asked, fixing a loose hinge, tightening a shutter. He moved with quiet purpose, as though working made it easier to breathe. By evening, the storm felt like a dream, already fading, and the saloon glowed with that golden calm that always came before night truly set in. The madam stood at the window, watching the street dry under the last streaks of sun. Behind her, the piano started to play again, soft, steady, familiar. The traveler paused to listen. "He's good," he said. "He was," she replied. The traveler looked at her then, understanding something she hadn't said. He didn't ask about it. Some silences didn't need to be broken. Outside, the last bit of storm wind sighed through the street, carrying the scent of wet earth and faraway thunder. Inside, everything was still, except for the slow rhythm of the piano and the two people who sat quietly, learning how to trust silence again. As the sun slipped behind the hills, the madam lit the lamps, one by one, the same way she had done every evening for years. The lantern light turned the saloon into something almost holy, shadows dancing on the walls, gold reflected in every glass and mirror. The traveler watched her work from his place near the bar, his silver watch resting beside his cup. "You light them the same way each night," he said quietly. "There's a rhythm to it." She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth barely moving. "Rhythm keeps the night steady," she replied. "People trust steadiness more than kindness." He seemed to think about that for a long time before nodding. Outside, the last color drained from the sky, and the stars began to push through. The air smelled of lamp oil and old whiskey. The piano played something slow, a song that had no clear beginning or end. It felt like the kind of music meant to fill a silence, not replace it. The madam moved toward the front window to check the shutters, and there, on the shelf by the door, she noticed one lantern she hadn't seen before. It was small, made of dull brass, with a handle worn smooth from use. When she picked it up, it felt heavy, as if it held more than light. "That yours?" she asked, turning toward the traveler. He looked up and smiled. "It is, old thing. Been with me longer than I can remember." She examined it carefully. The glass was etched with faint symbol circles and lines, almost invisible unless the light hit just right. "Those marks mean something?" she asked. "Used to," he said. "It belonged to my father. Said the symbols kept bad spirits away." He chuckled softly. "Never worked for him, though." She smiled, running her thumb across one of the carvings. "Still, it's lasted longer than most things," he said, taking it gently from her hands. He lit it with a match, and the small flame flared to life, glowing softer than the other lamps. "It's not much," he added, "but it's honest light. Doesn't try to outshine anything, just stays." The madam stared at the flame, small but steady, and something about it caught her, something about how it burned without demanding attention. It reminded her of the people who passed through her doors, brief sparks in the long dark. "Keep it lit," she said quietly. "The night feels lighter that way." He nodded, and together they placed it on the piano, where it cast a warm circle across the keys. The girls noticed it when they came downstairs, whispering softly about the strange lantern that glowed gentler than all the others. Some said it looked alive, as if the flame breathed. The madam didn't correct them. She liked the thought of a living light, one that listened instead of burned. That night, as the piano played and laughter filled the air again, the traveler sat near the lantern, his face softened by its glow. The madam found herself watching him more than she meant to how the flame reflected in his eyes, how his silence seemed to match the rhythm of the room. It had been a long time since someone's presence had felt peaceful, not heavy. When the last guests left and the lamps dimmed, The small brass lantern still burned. She stood beside it, watching the flame move gently within the glass. "Maybe your father was right," she whispered. "Maybe light like this does keep the bad away." The traveler, half asleep at the bar, opened one eye and said softly, "Sometimes it keeps the good close, too." Later that week, when the nights grew cooler and the desert winds softened, the madam decided to clean the back room, a place she rarely touched unless something forced her to. It was where the old things lived: forgotten furniture, empty bottles, crates of glassware that had long since lost their shine. She moved slowly, her steps echoing against the wooden floor. Dust clung to everything, as if time itself had settled there and never left. While she was sorting through a stack of broken frames, one small photograph slipped loose and fell to the floor. It was yellowed with age, the edges curling, but the image was still clear: a young woman standing in front of the very same saloon years earlier. Her hair was pinned neatly, her dress simple, her eyes proud and unguarded. For a moment, the madam didn't move. She knew that face. It was her own. Or rather, the version of herself that had existed long before this place had shaped her. She crouched down and picked up the photograph, her hand trembling just slightly. In the reflection of the cracked mirror on the wall, she saw both faces: the woman she had been and the one she had become. The difference was subtle but deep, like the space between light and its shadow. The younger version smiled, as though the world still belonged to her. The older one understood that the world belonged to no one, that it simply passed through your hands like wind. She brushed the dust from the photo and set it gently on the table. The traveler found her there an hour later, sitting still beside the mirror, the photograph between her fingers. He didn't ask what it was. "That you?" he asked softly after a while. She nodded. "Once, you look lighter," he said. "I was," she replied, "before I learned how heavy dreams can be." He didn't offer comfort, and she didn't want any. Instead, he poured 2 small drinks and set one beside her. They sat together in silence, the kind that didn't ache, but hummed quietly with shared understanding. "Funny thing about mirrors," he said finally. "They show you what's there, but not what's true." She smiled faintly. "And photographs show you what was, not what stayed." The words hung between them, gentle and true. Outside, the sun dipped lower, its last light catching on the edges of the mirror, making both their reflections shimmer for a heartbeat. In that glow, she almost believed the younger version was still there, live, hopeful, waiting for her. Maybe, in some small way, she was. The madam reached out and turned the photograph face down. "You keeping it?" the traveler asked. "No," she said softly, "but I'll remember where it was." He nodded. Not everything worth keeping needed to be carried. Some things stayed by being released. When she stood, her eyes caught the lantern on the piano in the next room, its flame steady as ever. For a moment, she thought she saw the reflection of her younger self dancing in that small circle of light. Maybe it was only the trick of the glass. Maybe not. The traveler took the photograph and slid it gently into the drawer beneath the bar, where it would rest among other forgotten things. "So she doesn't get lost again," he said. She didn't reply, but her eyes softened. For the first time in years, she felt not haunted by her past, but gently watched over by it. The night after she found the photograph was softer than usual. The air outside was cool and still. and the saloon glowed like a lantern in the quiet street. Inside, only a few lamps burned small circles of light, holding back the dark. The traveler was fixing the hinge on the door, humming low under his breath. The madam sat by the window, mending a tear in one of the curtains, her movements slow and methodical. Every few minutes, the piano creaked softly, as if remembering an old song. The storm was long gone, and with it, the restless energy that had hung over the place. Everything now seemed settled, like dust that had finally found where it belonged. When the traveler finished, he joined her by the window. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked, not looking at her, but out at the street, where the lamplight faded into shadows. "Every day," she said, "and every day I decide to stay. Why? Because someone has to keep the light burning, otherwise the dark wins." He smiled at that, the kind of smile that comes from understanding something you can't put into words. "You sound like my father," he said. "He used to tell me the same thing, only about campfires." She glanced at the small brass lantern on the piano, still glowing softly. "Maybe he was right," she said. "Maybe we all just carry our own bit of fire." They sat there for a while, watching the faint movement of the night. Somewhere outside, a coyote howled, its voice stretching across the still air. The sound wasn't lonely, it was alive, a reminder that the world kept moving, whether anyone watched or not. The traveler reached into his coat and pulled out the silver watch. He turned it in his hand, the light catching the engraved patterns. "You ever wish you could turn time back?" he asked. The madam shook her head slowly. "No, I just wish it would stop long enough to let me breathe." He nodded, closing the watch with a soft click. "That's fair." Silence settled between them again, deep and kind. The lantern flame flickered once, as if listening. The madam leaned back, her eyes half closed. "You staying long?" she asked after a while. "A little while," he said. "Long enough to remember what peace feels like." She smiled faintly. "Then you're welcome to stay as long as you need." Outside, the first pale edge of dawn began to rise over the hills. The light came slowly, brushing against the saloon windows until everything inside glowed gold. The piano keys shimmered, the bottles on the shelf caught small sparks of morning, and even the dust looked like stars. The traveler stood, slipping his watch back into his pocket. "Morning found us," he said softly. "It always does," she replied. "That's the trick of it. No matter how long the night, it always finds you again." He looked at her for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, quiet but sure. Then he tipped his hat slightly and said, "I'll see about fixing that window hinge next." She nodded. "And I'll make more coffee." The day began like that, simple, unhurried, made of small things that mattered more than they looked. As the sun rose higher, the saloon filled with the soft hum of morning life chairs being moved. Footsteps above, the faint notes of the piano waking again. The madam looked around her and thought with quiet certainty that maybe this was all she had ever wanted. Not perfection, not peace, but the gentle promise that no night lasted forever. Weeks passed, and the town slipped back into its usual rhythm. The storm was just a memory now, and the traveler had made himself part of the quiet repairing what broke, sitting by the piano in the evenings and leaving his lantern glowing beside the bar each night. The madam had grown used to the sound of his voice, low, thoughtful, the kind that never rushed. He spoke little, but every word carried weight, like stones in a pocket. One morning, the mail wagon rolled through town, raising a small trail of dust. The girls gathered near the window, hoping for letters that might never arrive. The madam watched from behind the bar, her expression unreadable. She didn't expect mail anymore. Her name had long since stopped belonging to anyone who wrote. But when the postman stepped inside, tipping his hat, he carried something small in envelope, yellowed and frayed. "This one's been traveling a long way," he said, handing it over. The writing was faded, but clear enough to Miss Clara Hensley, Dusthaven Saloon. Clara. She hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years. It felt strange, like hearing someone call to a ghost. The traveler looked up from his seat. "That you?" She nodded slowly, once. He didn't ask anything more. She took the letter upstairs, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. In her room, she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the envelope, as if it might vanish if she blinked. The seal had been broken long ago, the edges softened by time. She opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet inside. The ink had run in places, but she could still read the words. "Clara, if this reaches you, I hope you found some place to rest. I'm sorry I left the way I did. You deserved more than silence, but it's all I had left to give. I think about that night often, the one where you said the world never holds still long enough to love it. You were right. I hope, wherever you are, you found a way to stay still." It wasn't signed, but she didn't need a name. She knew the handwriting. It belonged to a man she had once loved in a different life, a life that had ended quietly, the way most real things do. She read the letter twice, then folded it back along its old creases. For a moment, she thought she might cry, but the tears didn't come. Instead, she felt a strange peace. The letter hadn't brought back pain or regret. It had simply reminded her that even the forgotten parts of her story had mattered to someone. She placed the letter in the drawer beside her bed, next to an old hairpin and a small coin she'd kept from her first night running the saloon. Then she stood and looked out the window. The street below was waking up the blacksmith's fire starting, the sound of boots on wooden boards, laughter drifting through the morning haze. She thought about how life never waited, how it always kept moving, quietly, steadily, no matter who stayed behind. When she went back downstairs, the traveler looked at her, then at the empty space in her hand. "Bad news?" he asked. She shook her head. "No news," she said softly. "Just time catching up." He nodded, and that was enough. Neither spoke again for a while. The lantern on the piano flickered once, steadying itself. The world went on, as it always did. That evening, when the day's heat faded and the first lamps were lit, the piano began to play on its own again. Not really on its own. Of course, the young musician had come early, his fingers finding their way across the keys like raindrops on a roof. But the sound felt different that night. Slower, gentler, full of something unspoken. The madam listened from behind the bar, polishing glasses that didn't need polishing. The traveler sat nearby, the lantern's soft flame reflected in his silver watch. There was no crowd that night, just a few quiet souls drifting in from the dusty street, drawn by habit more than need. The piano filled the empty space, its voice calm and knowing. It was an old song, one Ellis used to play, the notes stretching and folding like the rhythm of memory. When the musician finished, he turned to the madam. "That one's for him, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded. "For all of them." The boy smiled faintly, touched the piano once more, and went upstairs to rest. For a long time, she and the traveler sat in silence. The sound of the piano lingered, humming softly in the walls. "You miss him," the traveler said finally. "I miss the stillness he brought," she replied. "When he played, the world didn't seem so restless." The traveler nodded, his gaze far away. "Funny thing about music," he said. "It fades, but somehow it stays too. You carry it, even when you think you've forgotten the tune." She looked toward the piano, its keys glowing under the lamplight. "Maybe that's what we are," she murmured. "Songs that keep playing even after they've ended." He smiled slightly. "If that's true, you're a slow one, still playing long after most would have stopped." She laughed, quietly, a rare sound, low and soft. "Maybe I don't know how to stop. Maybe that's what makes you alive," he said. Outside, a light wind stirred the sign hanging above the door, the chain creaking softly. The night smelled faintly of sage and woods. It was one of those evenings that felt stretched thin, as if time had decided to move slower just for them. The madam walked to the piano and ran her fingers across the edge of the keys. The instrument seemed to hum in response, as though remembering her touch. Without thinking, she pressed one note, then another, and the sound filled the room, hesitant, trembling, but beautiful in its imperfection. The traveler watched her quietly, not daring to speak. She played for a while, no song in particular, just notes floating like breath. Each sound was soft and heavy at once, carrying the weight of all the nights she had survived, all the mornings she had waited through. When she stopped, the silence that followed was vast and kind. "That was lovely," the traveler said softly. "That wasn't music," she replied. "That was remembering." The lantern flickered once, and for a heartbeat, she could almost hear Ellis laughing somewhere beyond the light. The traveler must have felt it too, because he raised his glass slightly, as if to toast the unseen. "To memory," he said. She lifted hers. "To what stays." They drank in silence. Outside, the wind moved on, and the sound of the piano faded into the quiet like the last whisper of a dream you're not ready to wake from. The traveler stayed longer than anyone expected. The saloon, in its strange way, had become a resting place for him, a place where the noise of the world dimmed and silence didn't hurt. But every night, when the lantern burned low and the piano stopped singing, the same thought would visit him. The road was still waiting. One evening, as the sun slipped low behind the ridges and painted the windows in copper light, he told her, "I'll be leaving soon," he said simply, his voice calm, without regret. The madam looked up from the counter, where she was counting coins. "When?" "Tomorrow, maybe the next day." She nodded slowly, her hands pausing mid-count. "That time already. That time always comes," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Seems like everyone who stays long enough here ends up leaving. Except you. Except me," she said softly. "Someone has to keep the lights on." He didn't argue. Instead, he took a small pouch from his coat and placed it on the counter. Inside were a few silver coins, a folded map, and a tiny brass charm in the shape of a lantern. "For you," he said. She looked at it, but didn't touch it. "I can't take payment from you," she said gently. "It's not payment, it's thanks." "For what?" He thought for a moment. "For the quiet." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that hides both warmth and sorrow. "Then I'll keep it," she said. For the same reason. The evening passed softly after that. They shared dinner in the corner, booth bread, stew, and a bit of whiskey. The girls had gone to bed early, and the saloon was empty except for them. The traveler took out his silver watch again, winding it slowly. The ticking filled the quiet space between them. "Funny," he said, "how time feels slower here." "That's because you're looking at it," she replied. "Most people don't. And you?" "I learned to stop counting it," she said. "It only hurts if you measure it." He nodded, as though the thought made sense in some part of him he rarely visited. They sat there until the lantern burned low, and then she stood to blow it out. "Will you come back someday?" she asked, her voice gentle, uncertain. "If the road lets me," he said, "and if the light's still burning." "It will be," she promised. "It always is." He smiled, stood, and tipped his hat, slightly a quiet salute. "Then I'll find my way." When he went upstairs to pack, she stayed behind, her hand resting on the counter where his gift lay. The charm gleamed faintly in the dim light, catching the last reflection of the dying flame. She picked it up and turned it in her palm. The tiny lantern shimmered softly, delicate but strong. "For the quiet," she whispered, placing it on the shelf beside the piano. When the room finally went dark, she stood there for a moment, listening to the soft sound of the wind through the doorframe. Outside, the stars were beginning to wake. It was a night for goodbyes, though neither of them would say it aloud. In the stillness, the saloon breathed like something alive, an old heart still beating in the desert. Steady, patient, waiting. When dawn came, it was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, like the world is holding its breath. The traveler was up before the sun, his things already packed, his horse waiting near the hitching post outside. The town still slept, the windows dark, the dust on the street untouched by footprints. Inside the saloon, the lamps had burned low, leaving only faint halos of light on the tables. The madam stood behind the bar, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. She had woken early she always did. The sound of his boots crossing the floor broke the silence, soft and steady. "You're really going then?" she said, not looking up. "Looks that way. You could stay. There's always work and quiet and coffee that never runs out." He smiled. "You make a good offer, but the road keeps calling." "It always does," she said. He set his hat down and leaned against the counter, looking around the room one last time. "Funny," he said. "Place feels different in the morning, like it's catching its breath after dreaming." "It dreams every night," she said. "Of what?" "Of light, of people coming back." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe it's dreaming right now." She finally met his gaze, her eyes tired but kind. "You'll find what you're looking for." He hesitated. "Maybe not, but I'll find something worth walking toward." "That's enough," she said. "It always is." The silence between them wasn't heavy, it was full, like two pages pressed together. She reached under the bar and pulled out the small letter he had given her the night before. "If you ever get lost," she said, sliding it toward him, "this place will still be here. The lantern stays lit." He smiled softly, pocketing the note. "Then I'll follow the light." He placed a few coins on the counter, though she didn't count them. Instead, she stepped out from behind the bar and stood beside him at the door. The street was gold with early sunlight, the air still cool. "You sure you want to ride into that?" she asked. "That's the only way to see where it ends," he said. adjusting his hat. For a moment, he paused, looking at her, not the saloon keeper, not the woman who survived, but the still flame that kept burning when the rest of the world went dark. "Take care of this place," he said. "It's more than walls and whiskey." "I know," she said quietly. "It's memory." He nodded once, then turned and stepped into the morning. The sound of his boots faded against the wooden boards, replaced by the creak of saddle leather and the slow rhythm of hooves. She watched him until the figure became a blur against the bright horizon. Then, with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, she turned back inside. The saloon was bathed in golden light, soft and still. Dust motes floated in the beams like tiny stars. On the bar, his coffee cup sat half full, the steam long gone. She picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then poured it out and washed the cup clean. The small brass lantern charm caught the light on the shelf beside the piano. She reached out and touched it once, as if to promise she'd keep her word. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of hooves growing smaller, softer, until they were gone. The madam smiled faintly to herself. The world never stopped moving, but the light inside her never flickered. The day had begun, and so had everything else. Days passed after the traveler rode away, and the town of Dusthaven settled back into its familiar rhythm-quiet mornings, long afternoons, and nights that came soft as silk. The saloon remained the same from the outside. A small wooden building with a faded sign and swinging doors that creaked like an old lullaby. Inside, though, something had shifted. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt alive, filled with memory, like music that never quite left the room. The madam spent her mornings near the window now, the same spot where she once held the letter, where the light came in golden and warm. She would sip her coffee, watch the street, and sometimes catch herself listening for the sound of boots or hooves that never came. It didn't make her sad, just reminded her that everything worth remembering leaves an echo. One evening, just before dusk, she lit the lamps early. The saloon glowed again, golden in the half-light, the air thick with the scent of dust, whiskey, and something faintly sweet from the kitchen. The girls moved quietly, setting tables, humming softly to themselves. The piano waited, silent but ready, its polished surface reflecting the flicker of the lanterns. The madam stood behind the bar, straightening a row of bottles that didn't need straightening, when she noticed something on the shelf, the brass lantern charm. It caught the light and shimmered faintly, just as it had the morning he left. She picked it up, holding it close for a long moment. "For the quiet," she whispered again, smiling softly. She set it down in a new place, right by the lamp where everyone could see it. When the doors opened later that night, a few travelers came in, dusty and tired from the road. They looked around, saw the soft light, and exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for days. "You've still got the best glow in town," one of them said. "Always will," she replied. The piano began to play a new song this time, something slow and hopeful. The madam leaned against the bar, watching the lanterns reflect in the bottles, the laughter rising, the rhythm of life returning as it always did. For a moment, she thought she saw the traveler's reflection in the mirror behind the counter, his hat tilted, his smile easy, his eyes calm. But when she turned, there was only the lamp, burning steady. She laughed quietly to herself. "You always said you'd follow the light," she murmured. "Guess you did." The night wore on, gently. The music drifted through the air, soft and unhurried. She poured drinks, listened to stories, and when the piano player took a break, she walked over and pressed a few keys herself. Just a few notes, no song, but enough to remind her of everything that had come before. As the hours slipped by, she blew out one lamp after another, leaving just the small brass lantern on the piano glowing in the dark. Its flame danced faintly, alive and warm, like a heartbeat. She sat beside it for a while, her hands folded in her lap. The room hushed, except for the creak of old wood and the soft hum of the wind outside. "It's a good night," she whispered, to no one, and perhaps to everyone who had ever passed through her doors. Then, slowly, she stood, checked the locks, and climbed the stairs to her room. The saloon below her glowed with the last flicker of the lantern, a small, steady light against the endless dark of the desert. Outside, the stars were beginning to bloom, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the road carried on. But here, in Dust Haven, the lamps were lit again, and that was